So today we are diving into Specialist Disability Accommodation. We're unpacking what it is, who qualifies, and how you can successfully navigate the funding and application process. But before we get into the details, let's introduce the two organisations driving this conversation, KinKera Community and SDA Services. At KinKera Community, we're proud to be one of Australia's leading SDA providers. Our commitment to deliver a modern, purpose-built housing solution that empower people with disabilities to live independently and thrive in vibrant communities. With over 50 completed dwellings and another 150 scheduled by the end of 2030, our reach spans Queensland, New South Wales, South Australia, Victoria and Tasmania, with plans for expansion into Western Australia and the Northern Territory. Our passion for innovative, accessible living is at the heart of everything we do. And today we're excited to welcome Greg Barry, the founder of SDA Services. Greg and his expert team specialise in demystifying the SDA process, providing personalised guidance for individuals, families and support coordinators. With their deep knowledge of the funding landscape and a proven track record, SDA Services has empowered countless participants to secure the funding they need for quality housing. Our strong collaboration with numerous referrals and shared success stories demonstrates the transformative impact of combining expert advice with high-quality SDA solutions. In this session, Greg will talk us through the key elements of SDA, from eligibility and design categories to the intricacies of the application and approval process. Whether you're a participant, a support coordinator, or a family member, exploring housing options, you will gain valuable insights to help you make informed decisions and overcome common challenges. Let's get started on this journey to better understand and harness the power of specialist disability accommodation. Greg Barry from SDA Services, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Joe, for that terrific introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm joining you from southeast Queensland, Quandamooka country, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So, yeah, it's a privilege to be here and talk about these things. I guess starting with, I'd like to outline the topics that I've considered sharing with you today, and they're there on the screen. I sort of make some assumptions as to what people might be interested in, and I could get that wrong from time to time. So look forward to receiving questions in the chat. I guess it all starts with understanding what SDA is, and then the gateway to it being SDA eligibility, and then really a bunch of topics that are responsive to our experiences in the space over the time that we've been supporting participants for SDA outcomes. I'll start with also a bit about what is SDA, and there's some key elements on the screen there. When the policy was first announced, and I've been around it since back then, which was sort of the end of 2016, early 2017, the SDA rules were first promulgated. The NDIS estimate back then, and I think it's been repeated since, as about 6% only of NDIS participants would be eligible for SDA. So that number equated to approximately 28,000 people back then. I guess, anecdotal view is that might be a bit conservative, but we'll see as time goes on. What the decision makers, the architects of the policy, decided very early, an issue that they had to decide was whether the NDIS would produce this housing, or whether the policy would incentivise the private market, including for-profits and not-for-profits, to produce this housing. And they went down the incentivisation route, which I'm a big fan of. It creates a playing field of competition, which I think improves outcome as history and the policy evolves. Another announcement at the time was that it was an intended element of the policy that there be a separation of housing and other supports. I'm a big fan of that idea as well. The concept really simply being that if your housing provider and your other supports provider are the same person or entity, then your negotiating position is compromised by that fact if there's anything going wrong with housing or the other supports. That aspect of the policy hasn't been, I guess, enforced, to use strong language. I sense that there's a lot more rigour around from the agency and the Quality Safeguards Commission around the importance of that separation, and I do sense that that's going to be more rigorously enforced over time, if it's not already. I guess the final significant element of SDA, and it evolved a bit after the rules came out, is that there's been an SDA design standard produced, which is really focused especially on this policy and its intricacies, the design categories and building types particularly. And I'm a huge fan of the work that the authors of the design standard have put together for that. We describe it in our work as the gold standard across the board. In terms of us, we started in 2017, and the idea, I guess, was the perception back then, which hasn't reduced, was that it's a complex process, and participants then were having some trouble getting approvals in their NDIS plans. My personal passion includes my daughter Celine, who's holding my hand, or I'm holding her hand there. Celine was born with a very rare chromosomal abnormality, one of 15 people in the world, and my wife and I have been her carers and remain her carers now almost 32 years after her birth. So that's the sort of background to my interest personally and passion for the space. And I was in legal practice for quite a long time, so I had that sort of style of thinking that considers legislation and evidence, and that's been an influence, I guess, on the way we've done our work. Why do our services exist? It's because it's complicated. I had a borderline hilarious conversation before the last change of federal government with former Minister Shorten in his electoral office, and I explained back then what we do, and he said to me wryly and full of humour, Greg, you shouldn't have a job. And the reality is that it is because it's complicated that we've got a job, and no disrespect to the current government, our job hasn't reduced during their time in government. In terms of numbers of engagements, more than 1,780 engagements over those years. That's not for 1,780 people. We've had sometimes multiple engagements for participants whom were supported at first instance, but also in reviews and appeals processes. So best rough guess is we've probably supported around 1,400 Australians through this process so far, and we're really proud of the contribution that we've made. So it all starts with eligibility, so I'm going to talk about the elements of eligibility. The eligibility criteria for SDA, I describe it as the gateway to the support, sit within a division of the SDA rules, and the SDA rules we call subordinate legislation, which sits under the overarching context of the National Disability Insurance Scheme Act, NDIS Act. Within that division, there's this eligibility chapter, if you like, and there are two eligibility criteria, and then there's a third element called the SDA needs requirement. The two eligibility criteria are those words extreme functional impairment and very high support needs, respectively. And they're either or, so satisfying one of those is sufficient to get through the first gateway for consideration of SDA eligibility. And the first consideration we tend to have for that issue is the common words which exist in both of those criteria. And those common words are very high need for person-to-person supports. So that's a threshold for each of those criteria, only, as I said, one of which criteria needs to be satisfied. I attended a function when the SDA rules were first legislated back in around March 2017, where one of the wonderful architects of the rules was explaining them to the audience, and one of the audience members asked, what does very high mean? That's not scientific language. And the answer that came back was, very high means more than 6 hours of person-to-person support needs per day. So when we're speaking with people who support them, and family members, for example, about whether someone might be eligible for SDA, we first of all have a conversation about what support needs, person-to-person support needs, reasonably required, having regard to particularly safety and good practice in an ordinary day. Have lots of conversations with family members who provide informal supports, and when I raise that issue of 6 hours or more per day, sometimes faces fall and people become a bit disconsolate and think, well, we don't do that much. I carefully say to them then, well, let's just look at what an ordinary day looks like, and acknowledging that you probably don't keep a spreadsheet of everything that you do. And when we have a conversation then, oftentimes faces light up again. People don't realise just how much they do, oftentimes, when they're providing informal supports. It's an objective consideration. So what I mean by that is it's a consideration of what would be happening consistent with good practice, and sometimes that's not happening by virtue of dignity of choice for participants, or by virtue of availability of those supports. So it's a consideration of what would be good practice, not necessarily what's actually happening in a person's life. Person-to-person supports also includes assistance with accessing the community. So when considering that aggregation, take into account those times out and about in the community when somebody might need supports as well. Once we've had that conversation and very high need for person-to-person supports is considered, a likelihood, then I then talk about, well, extreme functional impairment separately. And the three activities that the rules prescribe for consideration are those three there: mobility, or self-care, or self-management. Ultimately, the evidence for whether someone lives with that level of impairment for any of those activities needs to be provided by allied health or health practitioners, and our experience has been most commonly dealing very happily with occupational therapists in the sector, and the agency is quite happy to receive functional assessments from OTs around these issues. But mobility isn't complex, and it's not straightforward, I guess. If someone needs to mobilise in a wheelchair in the home and in the community, then it's quite doubtless that they live with an extreme functional impairment pertaining to mobility. However, we've certainly supported a bunch of people who, say, mobilise using, for example, crutches and wheelchairs, according to whether or not terrain is suitable or whether they might be fatigued, just for example. The reason I've inserted those words objective and not subjective there is that oftentimes we meet people who might be mobilising, particularly in their dwelling, without using a wheelchair. That's because their place isn't accessible, and we meet people who might sort of surf the furniture to get around. We ask the question, and of course the OTs do as well, and consider what would be safe in a suitably accessible dwelling. What would be good practice? What would you prefer? What would work best in a suitably accessible dwelling? And very often the answer is that if my place was accessible, then I'd much prefer to mobilise around it in a wheelchair. So again, that's the issue of not being distracted necessarily by what's going on, but informed by what would be good practice. In a nutshell, if someone needs assistance, including prompting and supervision, for all of those activities, oversight, and active supports, then there's a reasonable likelihood that they live with an extreme functional impairment pertaining to self-care. In terms of learning experience, self-management has been the one where our understanding as an organisation has increased the most over time. It's such a broad issue. There are so many different diagnoses and impairments and conditions which are pertinent to an analysis of whether somebody might live with an extreme functional impairment for self-management. And I guess to my discredit, there are people who would have perhaps ruled out of SDA eligibility 7 years ago, who I would strongly suggest ruling in now, having had a bunch of experiences around this issue. At its heart, it's the ability to manage one's life, plan one's day, make decisions, manage one's behaviours sometimes. So a very, very broad range of conditions and impairments that are pertinent to this issue. So that's extreme functional impairment, mobility, self-care, self-management with an associated very high need for person-to-person supports, the thresholds for that. This is the second criterion, very high support needs. And the issue there is, again, that language, that very high need for person-to-person supports, which I discussed at the start. And then there's an either or at the end of that. Either there are limitations in the availability, capacity, sustainability of informal support networks, so people who don't get paid, or whether participants live with risk or pose risk to others that a suitable SDA place might mitigate. The issue of risk is really enormously common. If a person has that very high need for person-to-person supports, it's rare to meet a person in a cohort who doesn't also have some associated risk with their disability. And the next consideration then is, could that risk be mitigated by the provision of SDA? And our anecdotal experience is that there aren't many risks for that cohort of people that the wonderful SDA design standard doesn't mitigate. It's a matter which needs to be proven case by case. Then the final challenge for SDA eligibility is a separate consideration, which is described the SDA needs requirement. That's section 14 of the SDA rules. And in essence, what section 14 mandates is a comparison between an analysis of what life would be like SDA combined with other supports, with a setting where there's no SDA and just other supports alone, where our jargon for that is mainstream dwellings. And I've listed there my sort of primitive list of the types of mainstream dwellings which are relevant to that comparison. So there are a bunch of lenses for this comparison, and this SDA needs requirement is a really, topical and evolved focus of ours as to what needs to be proven to satisfy the NDIA that someone is likely eligible. So here's the needs requirements language. I've highlighted the introductory passage to it. In yellow, it's the combination of specialist disability accommodation. So that combination is really of interest to that issue. And it's combination of SDA and other supports. So it doesn't consider just the place. It considers how the SDA and other supports combine there. And the other bit of logic that flows from that is SDA in this consideration is considered as a support. So it's not just a place, it's there's some other aspects of SDA which I'll go through in a bit of detail that are beyond very relevantly design when you consider it SDA as an NDIS support. The subject matters for the comparison are those which are listed there, and 1 and 3, in my anecdotal view, are pretty easy to prove. 1, whether it's what might better assist the pursuit of goals. If a participant has articulated a goal consistent with SDA outcomes, then, and that's their right to do that, and it's the obligation of the scheme to record that goal, then that's really not a difficult threshold to meet. Stability and continuity of supports. I've talked about my admiration for the SDA design standard, and one of the owners of the standard's considerations when putting it together was the efficiency for facilitation of supports within an SDA dwelling. So it's not difficult anecdotally to suggest that the SDA really does assist stability and continuity of supports. Firstly, value for money. There's another bit of support legislation called the NDIS Supports for Participants rules. It prescribes what the decision maker must consider when considering whether a support, including SDA, is value for money. It starts with considerations of whether the support can produce the same outcome, and if it can produce the same outcome as the compared support, whether that can occur at a substantially lower cost to the scheme. So the first challenge for decision makers is, is the compared mainstream scenario the same outcome as SDA? And oftentimes considerations validly stop at that stage. However, if that issue is at all controversial, we've developed a practice of actually doing the numbers on whether the compared scenarios are or are not a substantially lower cost. And that was in response to decisions we saw which refused supports or refused preferred supports for SDA over a number of years, which said the support does not represent value for money, full stop. I scratched my head as to, well, how do you respond to that in the absence of being able to garner calculations for that? And we're very fortunate to have had a couple of colleagues into our organisation, one that's an economics guru and one actuarial scientist, and they sat in a room for 6 months and produced a financial model comparing SDA with non-SDA scenarios and SDA preferred scenarios with non-preferred SDA scenarios, and undertaken roughly 400 analyses for that over these few years, and overwhelmingly the net present value of the savings to the taxpayer, to the NDIS, which SDA manifests, is in far more than 90% of cases actually results in savings to the scheme. The final one, which I think is really our predominant focus now and our evolving attention, is putting together evidence to deal with whether SDA compared to other supports is more effective and beneficial. It's easy to start with, for me at least, to start with a hypothesis which says it is, but in fairness to the agency, it's the obligation of people supporting participants to actually prove that, to assist the decision-making process with evidence for that. And clearly, the gold standard, which I described the SDA design standard as being, is a relevant consideration comparing SDA design standard with other scenarios, for example, including public housing and private housing and rentals, etc., whether there's a reasonable likelihood that the design standards would be equivalent between those two, and overwhelmingly often they're not. And it is certainly highly relevant for design features being considered. It also occurred to me maybe 18 months ago that non-design features are also very relevant, and the background to that thinking included that we were having very respectful conversations with occupational therapists who are saying, Greg, I can see that this person has extreme functional impairment and or very high support needs, but particularly for improved livability, we can't see specifically the difference which design would make compared to other housing scenarios, leaving aside the issue of availability. And I ran those issues around my head a bit, and I resulted in conclusion that I was getting two things wrong. One is that it's all about design, and formed a view that it's relevantly about design, but also about other things, aspects of SDA as a support. And the other thing that occurred to me, which I think is in the next slide, is that it's not entirely the evidentiary burden of OTs, for example, and other health practitioners to provide the evidence about whether SDA is more effective and beneficial or not. It's highly relevant when they have clinical views around that, but there are other sources of information which I'll talk about. In terms of SDA being a support and there being non-design issues, we've probably amassed about a dozen that we try and weigh into the picture, but there's just three, I think, highly relevant ones to start with. All providers of SDA supports must be NDIS registered providers. If you compare that requirement to mainstream rental markets, for example, where landlords need only honour the terms of tenancy law, that obligation of providers is a much higher one, as it ought to be, given the vulnerability of SDA eligible people. So that weighs into the mix in our honest view as to how SDA compares as a support. Affordability is, in my view, highly relevant. Most of you are probably aware that the pricing payments framework for SDA caps how much an SDA provider can charge a person, the SDA eligible resident, for a reasonable rent contribution. That cap is available, for example, in public housing, but really nowhere else in the mainstream market. So that comparison is a really relevant one as well. And the final one, amongst many others that I highlighted there, is that because this is an incentivised support, that there's a high level of security of tenure, and oftentimes higher than other housing scenarios, given that SDA eligible people with that support in their plans are popular with ethical investors who have risked the capital for these projects. I mentioned, what I was getting wrong about whether it's entirely the burden of occupational therapists to provide this evidence, and my conclusion that it's not, that in fact anyone can provide relevant information for this issue, was assisted by the Supports for Participants rules, and there's those A, B and C there are quoted directly from those rules. The rules in that part prescribe what the CEO can relevantly consider when considering whether a support is effective and beneficial, and certainly expert opinion, certainly occupational therapists, for example, and the lived experience of the participants or their carers is enshrined in that piece of legislation. So it's really highly relevant to be asking participants about their lived experience and people who support them, and with the benefit of that lived experience, imagining what difference SDA would make for them, and that's prescribed as, and appropriately so in my view, as a really relevant consideration for whether SDA might be effective and beneficial for a person. So that's eligibility. We've got through the gates of the two criteria and the needs requirement, hopefully, and where that lands for a person who is eligible, having regard to those provisions, is Section 12 then imposes an obligation on the agency, the CEO, that the CEO must determine the SDA building type, design category and location. So there's no wriggle room in those words. Once a person is regarded as eligible, then they're entitled to a decision around their eligibility, affirming their eligibility and determining those three elements. Location, the last of those, in our experience, has just about never been controversial. So people provide us with instructions about their preferred location, which under the SDA rules is a statistical area. And always people have reasons for expressing that preference, relevant to their community and their connections and their history and their preference, for example. And the agency never tends to cavil with those preferences. The more controversial issues can be around design category and location, which I'll talk about a bit. So design categories, 4 of them in the SDA rules, and the language of the provision which says what's the appropriate one for the decision maker to choose. The language is specific needs. So the one of those which suits the participants' specific needs most appropriately is the appropriate design category. So I've got an anecdotal experience-based view around that, which is that because one of them must be chosen, and the most, I guess, granular in terms of responding to specific needs are high physical support, fully accessible and robust. And one bit of logic is that if someone doesn't suit those 3, then improved livability is the appropriate outcome for them. Having said that, improved livability, the design standard mandates some really helpful things as well, which need to be considered case by case. Luminance contrasts that assist some people to navigate their way around the dwelling, design which has regard to line of sight, and certainly design that reduces tripping and falls risks is highly relevant to improve livability. So it's not as simple as saying that if you don't qualify for the others, that's the one for you. The first 2, high physical support and fully accessible, respond to the needs of people who live with severe mobility impairments. And in NDIA decision making, the differentiator between high physical support and fully accessible is for high physical support tends to be where someone requires hoisting for transfers. And whilst that's completely correct and highly relevant, it doesn't. It's not an across the board rubber stamp for what differentiates those 2. The difference in the wording in the rules is, and requiring very high need for support, is the only difference in the wording of high physical support. So certainly needs for hoisting is relevant, and other high levels of support needs are also relevant considerations for differentiating those 2. And we certainly supported people who have achieved high physical support who don't require hoisting for transfers. Another, I guess, anecdote, if the difference relates to a person's ability to perform transfers using their upper body, another sort of sad issue to take into account is there's probably likely going to be a day where they can't do that anymore. So all parties, stakeholders, providers, everybody who's involved, and of course including the participant, should also respectfully consider that likelihood into the future and plan for that. And one good way of planning for that is for a person to be residing in a high physical support dwelling whilst they're in that fully accessible phase of their life. Robust, again, there's a tendency in decision making to focus relevantly on people with histories of property damage and also self-injury, including with glass. And that's highly relevant and appropriate that decision makers consider that. Again, it's not as simple as that. The SDA design standard for robust mandates certainly building materials that require this reactive maintenance, and also certainly prescribes appropriately toughened glass, but also has regard to noise, building materials with properties which make noise harder to get in and which can oftentimes trigger people, also for noise to harder to get out of the dwelling, which might create neighbourhood issues as well. Building types, that's the list there. There's a provision in the SDA rules, section 16, which prescribes what the decision maker needs to take into account when considering what is the appropriate building type, and it's got subsections A to M. A is preference, and on the next slide I'll talk about that in a bit of detail. When we're talking to people about which of those building type scenarios they would express a preference for, issues include more typically apartments are in more concentrated urban areas when compared to houses and village duplex townhouses. Village duplex townhouses and houses tend to have private open spaces, so outdoor garden spaces that apartments don't necessarily have. What influences a person's preference for those things, including what's the living arrangement that they would seek, whether they would be happy to share with another SDA eligible person or persons, whether they would wish to live with people of their choice who aren't SDA eligible, whether they would wish to live alone, are really pivotal considerations amongst others for expressing a preference. Sometimes pets, for example, can guide a choice around having private outdoor space, for example, in those other two scenarios. Group homes we don't tend to have people express a preference for, but sometimes we do, but that's a very rare one. Group homes are, under the SDA rules, are for persons of 4 or 5 residents sharing. I mentioned preference. We supported Anthony Kennedy, who is First Nations man and a survivor of the stolen generations, and I tell Anthony's story a fair bit with Anthony's express permission. So Anthony had a catastrophic injury and in his adulthood, and that had horrible consequences for him, including he ended up homeless in the community. When amongst that period, he also became a father to twins, and when we met him, he was in a boarding house, which was a bit rough. So it wasn't a suitable place in view of both parents for his twins to visit. So they were the prominent issues which guided Anthony's expression of a preference to reside in a 2-bedroom apartment as a single resident, a place where he could parent his children, a place where he could store some disability-related equipment in that second bedroom, and a place where he could conduct his work as a mentor in his community. And I mentioned that Section 16 has A to M. A is preference. The CEO must have regard to the participant's preference. So Anthony's decision at first instance was, instead of single resident 2-bedroom, it was 2 residents, so 2 SDA eligible residents, 2-bedroom apartment. He appealed that. It was an arduous journey for him. I guess on the steps of the hearing, he was offered single resident 1-bedroom apartment, and he maintained his preference for a 2-bedroom resident, a 2-bedroom apartment, for the reasons I said. And we'd championed the issue of preference, and also that Australia is a signatory to the International Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities, and raised that Article 19 of that convention says words to the effect that a person with disability has the right to choose where and with whom they live on an equal basis with others. Very happily, those submissions were accepted made by legal representatives for Anthony at the AAT, and the decision went just a bit further than we'd even hoped for, in that the decision maker mentioned the fact that preference is the first matter that the decision maker is obliged to take into account, and it was regarded in that context as a more prominent issue that needs to be considered. So that's why I sort of champion the issue that the preference is highly relevant, and living arrangement is obviously a logical subset of that. I gave evidence in that matter unrelated to the issue I've just mentioned. We suggested, the evidence that I gave included tables of people who had received 2-bedroom single resident apartment SDA outcomes prior to Anthony's quest for that. And the context of my evidence was, as espoused by the legal representatives for Anthony, was that the NDIA has an obligation to practice consistency in decision making, and those prior cases were helpful in that respect. So that evidence was accepted and welcomed. So that created a bit of a happy precedent for us that providing tables of prior decisions is a really helpful way to assist participants in this space. Another issue that comes up a bit in SDA decision making is SDA that in a participant's specific circumstances the responsibility of the NDIA, or is their housing more the responsibility of some other person or agency, for example? The relevance of that is section 34(1)(f) of the NDIS Act, and we've certainly seen the issue arise often, sometimes somewhat distractedly, where a person is homeless or at risk of homelessness, where the agency might say, well, homelessness is not an NDIS response. And sometimes also, amongst others, where people are under the age of 18 and where the agency might suggest that the housing might be the obligation of some other agency, or even people in a parental role. The risk of homelessness came up and was resolved very positively in a matter of HTDD, a person whom we supported who was in a car for 3 years and living with ASD level 3. That's the same person I mentioned before who has severe sensitivities to light and to noise. And in essence, the effect of those provisions of that decision was that on an analysis of goals, the habitability of HTDD was only capable of being assured by an SDA outcome having regard to her goals. So we welcomed that style of logic. We've supported a lot of people, and there's a list of successful outcomes for people under the age of 18. And really the consideration is, are there persons, or is there a person in a parental role there attempting to provide support for the person? Can they do it? It's the consideration. And on those 13 occasions, the agency or the AAT have accepted that it is the responsibility of the NDIS. A very topical issue is SDA legacy cohort. So and many thousands, I don't know how many, but possibly between 10 and 14,000 people are in this cohort who achieved SDA eligibility because they lived in SDA in state-funded dwellings when they became participants in the scheme and received that stamp. The position for those is, the last paragraph here is a response to the first two my questions. The last paragraph is a response from the agency, which verifies that that cohort of persons, if they're in that cohort, don't have to re-establish SDA eligibility when they seek to transition from those dwellings. I think that's going to be a very highly topical issue in the sector for some time yet. I mentioned at the start, we've supported a lot of people in reviews and appeals processes. They're roughly the numbers: 70% happy outcomes at first instance, 70% happy outcomes after S100 reviews. And in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, now the Administrative Review Tribunal, we do see 100% success, but for one matter which involved a very sort of a narrow issue around visual impairment in SDA. But for that, we've just seen terrific outcomes. The ART Act has recently come in. It's got something really positive in it. Participants can now, if they're not happy with the level of granularity of decisions they receive, they can seek a statement of reasons, and the obligation is the agency has 28 days to provide a statement of reasons for their decisions. So I started this journey believing SDA was fantastic. I still believe it is after all of this. And to validate that, we've been undertaking surveys, and we'll share these materials with you. That's 2023's results. We're in the process of repeating that survey now. Overwhelmingly, through qualitative and quantitative outcomes, SDA produces amazing outcomes for participants. So the journey is utterly worth pursuing. I was generally buoyed by everything that's on that page, and particularly, for example, participants on average regarded their safety as 5 out of 10 pre-SDA and 9 out of 10 post. So nothing but good news to share with you about how wonderful SDA is. I guess the amount of work we've done, I talked about value for money, the effective and beneficial survey outcomes. We garner a lot of research. We don't do research, but we garner a lot of research that are relevant to comparisons that I mentioned. And also we have an eligibility tool, which we took about 6 months to produce. It's now on our website, and everybody in this audience is able to use that tool without us knowing that you've been there. It's got privacy protocols in it, so it can be a very useful first step to considering whether somebody may or may not be SDA eligible. I'm sorry I went a little bit over. I hope that was helpful, and I certainly look forward to any feedback and particularly questions. Thank you all, and thank you, Joe, for this opportunity, and KinKera.
Oh no, thank you, Greg, for that amazing breakdown of SDA. I'm sure many of you in here, if not all of you, have learned something. And will now be better equipped to assist participants starting their SDA journey or improving the outcomes for their SDA applications. We're going to move into the Q&A session now, and we have received some pre-submitted questions, and I'd like to start with those before opening the floor to some live questions from the chat. Question number 1 was asked by Jamie, and he said, what is the likelihood of the NDIS reassessing people for SDA eligibility or changing an outcome, so single occupancy to a 3-person share, for example?
Thank you for the question, Jamie, and I considered it before this session. There's some comfort. I do think the likelihood is very small, and that's based on experience. And also there's a provision in a document called the SDA Pricing and Payments Framework, which talks about eligibility, and it says it's not envisaged that a participant once found eligible for SDA would lose that eligibility. So I guess that's a little bit different to your question, which is about building type, but I think the ethos that's in that has pervaded decision making generally, that once people have their SDA decisions, they're not tended to be reviewed sensibly, in my view as well. And another comfort that I can share with you is, I mentioned consistency in decision making. That's a broad objective view, but it's also very subjective for every participant. So the agency has an obligation to make consistent decisions for individual people from time to time for their circumstances, and to make such a utterly inconsistent decision to go from single resident to another scenario would be inconsistent if it's not evidence-based. So they're my reasons for thinking I don't see it as a substantial risk.
Number 2, Krishna asked minimum requirements and how to prove them other than an OT assessment.
I guess I've spoken a bit in my presentation about the evidentiary requirements for SDA eligibility. So I guess hopefully that's somewhat answered this question for you. I also did mention that yes, it's been common practice for the agency to welcome and for us to proffer occupational therapist assessments, but certainly the point you make is a correct one, that health practitioners and allied health practitioners all have the qualifications to provide relevant evidence. So it certainly doesn't rule that out at all. The key issues that practitioners provide assistance for, in my view, are levels of impairments, levels of support needs, what is the appropriate design category specific to a person's need, and also what would be the support model in an appropriate place. I think they're really the big headings for the contribution that health practitioners can make for giving evidence in this space.
Question number 3, Karen asked, very similar to question 4, I would imagine, in a sense, and perhaps you want to give a bit of context to what Appendix H is. Karen asked, I am looking into Appendix H, adjustments on multiple grounds at the moment, but one in particular I'm wondering about is when the location factor in the price guide is a gross underestimate of the real life building costs in that location. Is that legitimate grounds for an adjustment?
So, as you mentioned, background, Appendix H really helpfully now considers scenarios where SDA eligible people co-reside intentionally with people who are not SDA eligible. So responding, I think, to a history where people stood up and said, no, I want to live with my partner, my family, my children, for example. And what preceded Appendix H was Appendix G, and it was too difficult in my respectful view because it contained a whole heap of algebra, which even our in-house maths and economics people struggled with. So very hard to get an intelligible outcome to Appendix G. Then SDA pricing review happened and landed, I think, in about July last year, and it produced Appendix H, which replaced Appendix G and provided succinct tables for the pricing scenarios for all of the variables around design category, building type, etc. So good progress, good news, a lot more clarity for that. The issue of location factor was decided for each location at the time of that review and will be always redecided for subsequent reviews. So I don't have good news about location factor. I'm not aware of a process where you can interrogate or dispute the location factor allowance for a particular area. I could be wrong about that, but just I'm not aware of any basis for disputing the location factor that's been decided by those review processes. I'm sorry to give you not so much good news there. And I guess the intersection of that question with the next one includes what's the process for getting Appendix H? And that's been a little bit vexed. When it first materialised, the process from the agency side was to say, well, we'll consider it when we receive a quote from an SDA provider. What was wrong with that, and I wrote a paper about it respectfully, is that the rest of the sector receives an NDIS approval with the amount of SDA payment in that approval. And I describe that as a shopping voucher. And what that's good for is for the participant to be at the table with providers with some certainty for themselves, but also with some certainty from the investment side of that conversation. So the process for Appendix H to await the quote being submitted was no good for either side of that process, because the place has to come out of the ground first. So too much of a period of uncertainty. So we now and have been successfully seeking Appendix H by Section 48 reviews, and the agency's been responding to those very positively. So that's the history, and that's the process that I'm recommending now, is to seek an unscheduled review and just setting out the living arrangement choices that underpin that aspiration.
So question number 5, Janice asked, is it possible to buy into concierge model SDA, that is one of, say, 10 or less apartments, preferably off the plan?
The answer, and hi Jan, I think I know who you are, Jan. It's good to hear from you. The answer is definitely yes, and we've supported someone recently who acquired an existing apartment which was vacant. In that way, we're at the part of the process now where everything's been confirmed except whether that person's OOA payment will be part of their SDA payment. So I don't know. We're pioneering in that respect for that one. But the answer is definitely yes. It's an open market. You can buy from any stock that's available as a person with disability, just like anyone else can. It's a matter for negotiation, and I guess the hallmarks of the marketplace include, unfortunately for people with that aspiration, is if the in inverted commas, I guess, if the provider has someone resident there, the likelihood of them wanting to sell in the marketplace reduces heaps. So the opportunities, I think, would be primarily in existing vacant dwellings, has been our experience so far. And off the plan, I haven't seen anything of, but I wouldn't rule it out, Jan.
We've had a couple more questions published here from the attendees. Karen asked, is it much of a problem at ART if you've been stating you want to live in a certain location, but towards the end have changed your mind to a different location? A lot can change in 2 years.
I think that's a really valid question. I don't want to give a sort of a across the board, advice in inverted commas, not knowing all of the circumstances, but what influences my response is what I said earlier, is the agency doesn't, in my experience, consider location as a really highly controversial issue at all. We've never seen people need to review or appeal location decisions, and from that perspective, I can't imagine why they would resist a change in location preference if it was explained appropriately. And I guess that's all I can say with what little I know about this particular case.
Ashley has asked, is an SDA provider entitled to get the participants' rental assistance? And if so, how does the provider go about it? What is the process?
Okay. So the overarch, it's an SDA provider is entitled to seek a reasonable rent contribution, and the market that's far more common than not in the marketplace. I mentioned that the amount that an SDA provider can seek for a reasonable rent contribution is capped. What it's capped at is the equivalent of 25% of a disability support pension amount and 100% of Commonwealth rental assistance sum where applicable. If a provider seeks more than that, they actually have to create a notification to the NDIA as to their intention to do that and the reasons for doing that. So that just doesn't tend to happen a lot in our experience. The other answer to your question is that this is a marketplace, and I've certainly seen participants negotiate the expectation for reasonable rent contribution downwards, including for a limited period, some months or something like that, as an incentive to enter a particular place. So the core message is it's capped. Messages are it's capped and it's negotiable.
Thank you very much. I hope that answers your question there, everybody. I wanted to thank Greg once again for completing this webinar today, and we hope that everybody here has found it useful and that it contributes to getting the results that you want for your participant, family member, whatever the case may be. We hope the webinar has offered valuable insights into the SDA process and clarified the steps involved with navigating funding, eligibility and housing options. At KinKera Community, we're dedicated to delivering high quality, purpose-built SDA homes that empower people with disabilities to live independently and enhance their quality of life. So whether you're a support coordinator, a family member, or an NDIS participant, our team is here to help you explore SDA solutions tailored to your unique needs. And securing SDA funding can be very complex. So this is why partnering with experts like SDA Services here is so important. And Greg and his team specialise in guiding participants and their support networks through that application process, helping to maximise the chances of a successful outcome. And if you need expert assistance with your SDA funding journey, we highly recommend reaching out to SDA Services. You can find more details about our services and contact information on our websites. It's kinkera.com.au. SDA Services you can find at sdaservices.com.au. Thank you again for your time, and thank you to Greg.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you, Joe. Thanks all for attending. Bye now.
Yeah, everybody. Thank you.